It's very difficult to have a thorough conversation when two people are like pointing fingers at two completely different causes to the particular issue.
And it's not just two people. This is why democracy is an experiment.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Rich and Regular podcast, where we explore life at the intersection of money. I'm Kirsten.
And I'm Julian. And today's episode is about the upcoming 2024 presidential election.
It's tomorrow.
Tomorrow is the big day.
The big day.
This is a really, really big conversation. And so we are going to do our part. I'm speaking to myself here to try to be brief.
Please be brief.
We want this to be a focused conversation. This is also a bit of I don't want to say a shift, but, we have not really had the privilege or an opportunity to talk about an election because we've not had a podcast during a general election. And so this is a bit of a first for us, but it is also a really important time. Obviously, there's a lot on the line. There's a lot at stake. And, given the mission to explore life at the intersection of money, I can't think of a better opportunity to do that than today.
We're not a political podcast, but we don't mind talking about politics sometimes. You know what I mean? Like, we're not one of those podcasts that just stays away from all things political. And at first I was a little hesitant to have this conversation because I didn't want this to just be about like each of their policy positions. But I think the angle that we're going to take, which is how it impacts your wallet, focusing on economic policy, financial policy, is helpful. And what really pushed me over the line was I saw Kamala on Club Shay Shay with Shannon Sharp. And I realized the way that both of these candidates are using podcasts as a means to explain civic engagement and actually add some language and context around their policies.
Yeah.
And I felt like we owed our listeners the same thing.
I see it a little differently. I don't think it's a matter of
it's not like indebted to them.
Yeah, no, and this is not, no disrespect to listeners and viewers. I think this is also just recognizing that people are really busy and they don't really have the time to go deep. They want to, but they rely on podcasts and some of these other platforms to make sense of all the noise. And, as trusted voices and people who I would say are of good intellect, we have the time and the freedom to kind of dive into some of these topics, probably more than most people do. And so it's important above, anything else or any other reason. And, we have a platform, and it would be, I'd say, silly of us not to use that platform. With that said, I want to jump right in. The last thing I would say is politics is a really big and expansive conversation. So we are going to focus this primarily on the economic issues, like how this potential election or whoever is elected president, and obviously we have two probably couldn't be more polarizing figures and leaders with wildly different points of view. It will have an impact on more than just your wallet, and we'll get to that. But we want to focus the conversation. So we do have to take a little bit of a step back, and I want to talk. Well, no, I'm saying I'm talking primarily about.
You always set yourself up, so let's jump right in. But first,
this is me jumping right in.
I need to step back, and I want to explain.
I said that weirdly. I am jumping right in. I want to start with talking about cost of living and inflation. And I'm saying in order to do that thoroughly, we have to go back in time a little bit just to kind of help people understand the baseline. And so when we're talking about inflation, we're talking about the general power or worthiness of the dollars that we earn, right? Your ability to buy X amount of products and services with that dollar today relative to last year or compared to what you may have been able to do in the past. That's what inflation is. That is something that is tracked on a pretty regular basis. And so in 2019, inflation was measured at around 1.8%. In 2020, that number was 1.2%. In 2021, this is after the impact of the coronavirus. And obviously there was all kinds of supply chain issues and supplies and goods being left in the middle of the sea. And we just didn't really know what was going on. Once they crunched the numbers, that number jumped up to 4.7%. Now, again, without context, it was like, all right, what does that mean? Well, normally what we're aiming for is right around 2%, right? Like we know that it's a natural phenomenon that these things change over time, but we had some periods of really low inflation leading up to 2021. That number more than doubled in 2021. And I think a lot of people felt that. and were even
Everybody felt
more
it.
surprised in 2022 when we hit a new high.
Yeah.
Inflation was 8%. It's a 40-year high. You got to go back to some of those social studies classes for my millennials out there, and you start thinking back to textbooks. At least I do. Like, I go back to when I first started learning about inflation and wondering what it looked like, and looking in textbooks and seeing pictures of gas signs and saying, "Oh my gosh, I remember when it was 79 cents and now it's $1.20." Like, it seems minor when you're looking at it on paper, but when you're an adult living through it, it's tough. And it's not just gas, it's food, it's eggs. It was a big thing about eggs. I mean, it's auto insurance. It's like so many things. Airfare. Remember when we were flying around in
Oh
2020?
yeah, we was recording podcasts about
It was like, oh
road
yeah,
trips,
we can
traincations,
let's
like
travel.
do anything.
Oh,
Stay home.
it's affordable. Let's go.
Do a staycation.
Put a mask on and hit the road, But now you look at the prices and they are like crazy. Like, anyway. So all that to say, inflation. It's a hot topic. It is obviously one of the primary topics that both candidates and both parties are talking about. And both candidates have wildly different points of view
Absolutely.
on how to solve for this.
I like to think of inflation as a silent tax. It is something that everybody acknowledges exists. We know that the price of goods eventually go up over time.
Yeah.
But in the past, the agreement has been that your employer is responsible for covering inflation.
Yeah.
Right? All those merit increases, all those raises that you work so hard for, they're around that 2 to 3% range in order to give you enough to cover it.
For that reason. Based on the data that is provided to them.
Exactly.
That's what they should be doing. Yeah.
But in a world where companies are also struggling because of this global pandemic, they were not able to do it. The government's looking at them, they're looking at the government, and it's like that Spider-Man meme where they're just pointing at each other and like, who's on first, right?
Yeah, you cut the check.
You cut the check. Right? You got the money. No, you got the money. And so both of these candidates' policies are a reflection of that tension about who really owns handling inflation. And it's weird because, again, it shows up everywhere. My spending is kind of split between large multinational companies, things like, grocery stores, big box retailers, like big stores, and local shops, small businesses. And I've seen it increase across the board. Like, it's literally baked into everything. If you are a nail tech or a hairstylist and your rent has gone up or the cost of shampoo has gone up, they eventually have to pass that cost on to the customer.
Yeah.
That's not them price gouging. That's not them trying to take advantage of a situation. They're literally trying to make the math work.
Yeah.
But I think what the challenge is that for bigger businesses, a lot of the businesses that these small businesses rely on, the price increases weren't just a result of supply chain and pandemic problems.
Yeah.
It was a lot of corporate greed mixed up in there, and it's been proven, it's been reported on. There's all kinds of hot mic moments from different CEOs who took advantage of the tight supply chain and raised prices, and they were taking advantage of the fact that consumers hadn't noticed and they were still buying at the same rates or higher, and so they kept them there.
Yep.
And so now we're just trying to figure out like who actually owns it.
Yeah, it's been interesting. There were several, to your point, hot mic moments. The big one, I think, was like the Kellogg's CEO who said something to the effect of like, we actually like enjoy these kinds of periods. He's basically referring to the fact that like, more people eating cereal for dinner because that's all they can afford is a good thing for us.
Right.
There was the AutoZone CFO who called inflation, and I'm quoting here, a little bit of our friend in terms of what we see in terms of retail pricing. But there were several like CEOs who were openly sharing on earnings calls like, man, I don't know about y'all, but like this is really, really
good.
They
have to. They have to disclose it.
Yeah. And you can also, like, if you just even did like a rudimentary analysis of some of these income statements, you can look at it and be like, yeah, well, profit was not driven by, anything other than raising prices. And if we're not seeing a rise in costs, well, it's pretty clear that the rest of that was pretty much gravy. I'm going to play devil's advocate here and say that there are also reports that say, well, yeah, that happened, or there are a few bad apples, but that was not a driving contributor to what we saw in terms of inflation. And so, to your point, the Spider-Man meme is a great example. It's like, well, no, it was greedy corporations, and others like, no, it was actually,
incompetent
government and restrictions and regulations that got in the way, and we had to pass those costs on, and so on and so on. Either way, both candidates have developed a point of view on this. And I want to start with what Kamala Harris has proposed. And so to fight inflation, and I'm just going to run through a couple of bullets here. One of the things that she has proposed is cutting taxes for the middle class. This is basically anyone earning less than $400,000 a year of household income. She has a plan for making housing more affordable. In part, this, I believe, is offering credits for first-time homeowners or, first-time home buyers. Like you kind of see these programs come in and out. She's proposing that with a higher down payment support through the government. She's also, if I'm not mistaken, proposing to use government funds to help solve for the inventory crisis, because in part that's what's driving up the cost of buying homes. For business owners, certainly small business owners, she's looking to expand the startup expense tax deduction. This is for new businesses, and that would be anywhere from like $5,000 to $50,000 to combat what we were just referring to. She's looking to crack down on corporate greed. If you follow her on X, you can see that every now and then she points her finger at some of these companies, both large and small. I think pretty recently there was some pretty bad weather down in Florida, and you saw people jacking up the prices for things. And so
for
she's
flights out,
or
which is
gas
crazy.
or any of those things. Like she's been fighting back. She's also been poking at Big Pharma, which can be controversial because we know that they are big contributors to both of these campaigns. Lots more on childcare affordability, Social Security, lowering energy costs, and of course, the quandary that is student loan debt relief. On the other side, you have Donald Trump and his campaign. And I have to say, before I go any further, when I was doing research in preparation for this, like I didn't even want to go to the website. I was like, I don't want to click on this thing because I don't want there to be like a bunch of retargeting ads. I don't want to start getting text messages. But I was like, you know what? In order to be as balanced and well informed as possible, I kind of have to go to the website, and I get there and I'm clicking around, and I'm not even gonna lie, like, it was some of the wildest shit I've ever seen in my life. Like the interpretation of how to combat inflation was wild. Like, how you hear that, like, oh, there's not a plan, or, well, he says these things, but he doesn't really mean it. Like, he's just saying that to do tough talk. It was like, no, like it's in text
It's on
too.
the website.
Like, it's not just him being, for lack of a better word, not as eloquent, or that's just how he is to try to relate to the everyday man or woman. But on the website, his plan, and this, a lot of this is just flat out verbatim. It says defeat inflation and quickly bring down all prices. How's he going to do that? He's going to unleash American energy. He's basically going to go big on oil, gas, even nuclear, lifting all restrictions. And so climate, environment is no longer a concern. Like, unleash American energy. And I'm not quoting here, but basically at all costs. How else is he proposing to defeat inflation? The next is to restore peace through strength. This is real words, right? I'm going to restore peace through strength. He's going to pursue lower prices on energy from countries. Basically, as you think about our dependence on foreign oil for a wide variety of reasons, right? Like, that's a big topic of conversation. It's as old as dirt. But he's basically going to fight back and help lower prices of oil that we're going to get there through like any means necessary. Third bullet, no bullshit. And I apologize for those who might have kids in here, but stop illegal immigration. He believes that is a heavy contributor to fighting inflation. Like, it goes right back to like the idea of blaming someone specifically, like having an enemy to point at or to defeat in order to bring this down. The last one I will say I'm actually not in disagreement with. It says rein in wasteful federal spending. I would imagine this is, remember what he started with the whole drain swamp kind of thing. This is
You probably
rein in.
disagree on the areas that are considered wasteful.
Yeah, the Department of Education is one of those
that's not a
primary
waste.
categories. But yeah, he wants to rein in wasteful federal spending. He wants to cut costly and burdensome regulations. And so, again, this goes right back to his point around trying to unleash American energy. He wants us to be the number one provider, to not be reliant on any other country for anything else. And the last one, which I am less familiar with, but it was around cutting costly and burdensome regulations, specifically reinstating deregulations policies, which he, quote, saved Americans $11,000 per household. Now, I will say this, and I'm not an expert in this category, but when you think about some of the people who may live in the Rust Belt, Ohio, West Virginia, Appalachia, right? Like, these are Americans too. And to his point, a lot of these economies have been devastated by deregulation, right? You're talking about decades, since centuries, maybe even, of communities that were reliant, very similar to what you can think of as like old Detroit, where people were building cars there. And then all of a sudden, there's a mandate that comes in that says we're no longer going to be building cars here. You're going to outsource them. Like, it's devastating. All of that to say, I think you have two very different proposals that are based on two wildly different interpretations of what inflation is and how to actually solve for it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's pretty much what both parties are proposing. So you can imagine like how wild the debate is, right? It's like, I want to have a conversation. Let's talk about this. And it's like, nah, you think he's crazy, but no, he legitimately believes that we're not talking about the right thing. We should not be talking about like how to make it work through influence or reaching across the aisle. Like, it's these people that are the issue. It's these countries that are the issue. It's these regulations and these
Mm-hmm.
concerns about the environment and climate change. That's the issue. And we shouldn't even be talking about those things. And if you elect me, I'm going to like ensure that that happens. And so like, this is why we're like so like in opposition. Like, it's very difficult to have a thorough conversation when two people are like pointing fingers at two completely different causes to the particular issue.
And it's not just two people. This is why democracy is an experiment.
Yeah.
In other countries, the narrative, the purpose, the value, the role of the government, all of that is streamlined and passed on. You don't get to decide, you don't get to debate, you don't get to like pick. In the United States, you absolutely do.
Yeah.
And so if you believe that this country is literally a bunch of united states, which means that each one has its own leadership, its own set of problems, and it's just woven together, when the role of the federal government is really to apply thoughtful bird's eye view planning, coordination to solve the ones that are affecting the most, then you're likely voting for the Harris campaign. Those are her policies. She's looking at high level, what's affecting a lot of people, and I'm going to write policies according to that. Now, on the other hand, if you believe that the federal government's job is to stay out of the way of individual state leadership by doing things like lifting regulations, regardless of downstream impacts, tightening our borders so that Americans have fewer folks to compete with for jobs, giving corporations unlimited power, more power than they have today, then you're likely voting for Trump. But it starts with that. Like, I read a while ago, this was before the pandemic, so it's probably changed because of remote work. But I read a while ago that the typical American lives 18 miles from their parents. Most Americans have never lived in multiple states. Most people haven't even ventured far from the hometown that they were raised in. And so a lot of us have no idea how different people live across the country. When that context is missing, it's very difficult to make decisions based on the greater good, or even to make room for the idea that what's true for you isn't true for somebody else. Some people truly can't imagine living somewhere where there are no jobs available, and you immediately dismiss people who are struggling and saying like, yo, when people come in and work for cheap or work for free, it takes away the very few jobs that we have. There are others who can't imagine a world where you sit at a desk all day, type words into a screen, and make six figures. And the biggest complaint is that, you know, you're in meetings all day, or that lunch is no longer free. Each of those people are going to hear these policies that are totally opposite and both say, that sounds great. The other person's an idiot.
Yeah. And, you know, I will say this before we move on. You know, I'm really, really grateful. There was a time in my corporate career where I was traveling like 50% of the year, you know this. And I was jealous of my colleagues because they were getting to go to places that I deemed like sexy. Like, they were going to New York, and
that would be me.
You were going to like South America and like California. And I was like, I'll be in Ohio this week, and I'm going to Kentucky. And I was in these places, and I'm not gonna lie, like at the time I was like really upset about it. But looking back, like, first of all, I met some of the nicest people I've ever met in the world. But two, I got to see up close what these places actually look like in both like urban and suburban and rural environments, because this is where like a lot of these meetings and construction and all that stuff was happening. And it completely blew my mind, like what I was seeing. Like, I fully understood why people would be so upset, because I was framing it up around what we were experiencing in our neighborhood at the time, which felt like it was a neighborhood that was in transition, but it was still good and was still safe, and we still had access to all the cool things. But like, we'd go to New York and be like, oh my gosh, we don't have this yet, right? So like, there's cutting edge stuff happening in like these big cities, major markets, There's suburbs that like may not get it yet, but like, oh, we're about to get just making it up, a Whole Foods or the new Chipotle. Have you seen the new ones? Like, oh, they're different. You go to Middle America and it's like going back in time, man.
Yeah.
It was like, nah, they still got the old version of the thing just came out there, and it's falling apart. And so the level of removal you had, like you're completely disconnected, to your point, from some of the complaints that people have. Is like, I'm sorry, you're complaining about like your AirPlay not working. It was like, we still got the iPhone 10 over here. You know what I mean? And so, and that's a terrible example, but like in terms of infrastructure.
But in terms of the impacts of inflation, it's a real example.
Correct.
Like there is some inflation. 8% is crazy.
It's crazy.
In a world where they're not making extra money. They never had discretionary income. They never like
Microsoft is not building a new campus.
They're not hosting the Olympics.
No. It's not even an option.
You know what I'm saying?
And so, yeah, I say all of that to say, I still carry that experience with me today. And it's hard to, but like I carry it and then I use it as a lens to interpret some of these policies and the frustration. I still don't like make a decision to support some of those things, but to your point, there's a balance to be struck, which goes back to democracy, between the amount of control we want the federal government to have versus what states can control. I want to go a little further though and talk about some of the things that I saw on Donald Trump's website. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but like just to give you an idea of like how serious he is. Like these are written in plain sight for all eyes to see. He wants to cancel the electric vehicle mandate. You remember years ago when they were talking about, yes, they're going to slowly phase this out. We have to transition. We have to start making better decisions. We need to prepare our country for the future. We got to stop letting, I'm just making up, China and these other countries like beating us. He wants to cancel the electric vehicle mandate. He wants to cut federal funding for any school pushing critical race theory, radical gender ideology, and other inappropriate racial, sexual, or political content on our children. He wants to keep men out of women's sports. Like this is verbatim, right? Like it's not just talk or things that he's saying on a podcast or on television. Like these are real proposals. He wants to secure our elections, including same-day voting, voter identification, paper ballots, and proof of citizenship, right? Like straight up Jim Crow proposals. You know what I mean? It doesn't sound like in a lot of cases that these things have a direct impact on your wallet. It seems like, I thought we were talking about money or economic policy. But if you think about the tone that these kinds of things set for corporations who are also employers, and the kinds of experiences that a lot of people have on day to day, it brings me back to so many of, unfortunately, some of the worst experiences that I had at work. Without question, you can start to see the connection here. Like when you have a leader who is in charge that is setting a very different tone, it gives power to other bullies or other people to fully say, you know what are you going to do about it, right? Like if the president is doing these things or is saying that these things are not mandatory, like you can forget about DEI and all that stuff. Like that stuff completely goes away.
Pay transparency,
all
wage equity.
All of those things, all of those protections for workers, all of those things that
overtime.
Profit and profitability becomes the primary motivator. Your well-being, the environment, any of those other things just becomes fluff. Like this idea that corporations can also do good, all of that stuff for the most part goes away. There is a direct, impact there in terms of how people earn money, their willingness or even ability to work for certain companies, those kinds of things. All of that stuff, like it certainly without question has an impact. And so that's why I wanted to talk about those things. So that's just a general overview of both the Harris campaign and the Trump campaign, some of their proposals, but certainly just the general tone in terms of how they are looking to address one of the most critical issues that are impacting the everyday aspects of our life, like general cost of living and fighting hyperinflation.
It's not just cost of living, it's also quality of life, right? Some of these policies, while they may not affect your wallet immediately, when you talk about eliminating EV mandates and pumping more energy and gas and oil, we're talking about exacerbating climate change. And ask anyone who has had their house destroyed or their town destroyed from a random hurricane or is experiencing 90-degree weather in November, that like there's a consequence to that. There are wildfires, there are floods, there are all kinds of things.
I was going to say also an accelerated degradation of property.
Yes.
right? Like rules used to last 20 years, and I'm saying this on behalf of, I sit on the board for my son's school PTA, and we're having conversations about like having to raise funds to replace the playground, and we have to install shades, and it's
You
going to
have
cost
to.
us because kids can't go outside and play recess. It's like basic things, you know what I mean? And so like the government does play a role here. If there's no protections and it exacerbates heat and climate change, and you live in a city where people actually don't have the surplus resources to make the donations to help protect the kids, it's like it all sort of trickles down and then becomes everyone's individual responsibility. And you just kind of ask yourself, like, is that really what we want? Like, isn't there a better way that we
Yeah.
might be able to address some of these issues? And so this is what's on the ballot. This is exactly what we're asking people to vote for. And so hopefully, if you were undecided, hopefully this conversation helps to steer you in the right direction. I ain't gonna lie about it, in one particular direction.
We ain't gonna tell you what to do. We just gonna
I
explain the stakes. And our goal is really just that people actually vote. Because I don't think there's been a time where we have had an impact on geopolitical decisions like we have right now.
Yeah.
20 years ago, if you voted, you weren't affecting like what wars would take place, what tariffs would take place. Now, each of these presidents has a stance on that.
For
And
sure.
if you vote one way, there's going to be global consequences. Now, you mentioned companies and corporations and giving them more power. And I think one of the questions people have to ask themselves is what happens when companies are unregulated?
Yeah.
What evidence do we have that they actually do the right thing and enforce themselves? And the answer is very little, right? We can see that right now with all of the food recalls that are out there, all of the Boeing plane parts that are flying out of the sky. When you take away regulations, it's not like corporations have this soul that guides them, this moral compass that guides them to do the right thing.
Well, the idea is that competition sort of solves for everything, right? Like
But
if
there's a
one
monopoly
company,
right now. There is no
correct,
competition. So
correct.
that's the challenge.
And lives are lost while competition sorts things out. Like
Absolutely.
that's the general belief here.
I brought that up because I want to talk about the stock market. And obviously, we're doing this because we want to know what policies and tactics and strategies each of these candidates have and the after effect that it's going to have on our finances. And we can't do that as investors without talking about the stock market.
Yep.
There's really no way of kind of forecasting what the impact will be, regardless of which president wins or loses. But with Trump, we can look at his previous term and see how the stock market performed when he was president from 2017 to 2021. So during that time, the stock market actually did really well. If you're looking at the S&P 500, if you had invested $10,000 in the S&P in January of 2017, you would have had almost $17,000 by the end of that first term. Like
Yep.
it was busting, right? By most measures. Even if you weren't invested in the S&P, if you had any money in the stock market, you would have seen some positive growth, which was in part a result of several things directly related to the Trump presidency.
Mm-hmm.
Tax cuts to corporations, which allowed them to boost their profits, and these deregulation policies that we talked about, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you only look at the end result, you're going to miss a lot of what happened in between, which is that he inherited an economy that was already booming.
Yeah, I mean, he put, what they call that, like the charcoal gasoline. He like the whole, was it wood bridge? I don't know the name of that
He
company.
squirted the
He
lighter
he
fluid on
squirted
the
lighter
grill.
fluid on a hot grill.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to be honest, right?
And there's nothing wrong with taking credit for improving an already good situation. Like low key, that's what a lot of us do at work every day. That's what a lot of y'all do at work every day. No shade. But if you don't zoom in on the fact that actual period, you miss that there were several things that he did that also created a bunch of volatility. Like the way that he mishandled the pandemic, the trade wars with our North American neighbors, which raised prices on a lot of the imported goods, a wave of hate crimes, which many would argue that he incited and fanned the flames on directly. And then all of the, other things that he is currently either already been found guilty for or is currently facing an indictment for. Like there's a bunch of stuff in between that makes you question how he got the result that he got.
Yeah.
And I think that's worth bringing up. Like it's like a athlete who was found to have used performance enhancing drugs. It's like, yeah, you won, but you don't get to keep the trophy. Like,
yeah, we're talking about the stock market here, but again, it's difficult to just talk about any one thing when we're talking about politics. But you kind of knew this would happen, right? Like I remember when he was a candidate, and obviously there was concerned that he wasn't really being serious and he's not really going to do these things and he's just being hyperbolic and trying to get elected, but he's not actually going to try to, put these things into action. And that was proven to be wrong. But you certainly knew, like just looking at some of his proposals, that he believed that by simply cutting taxes, it was straight up playbook out of like Reagan and
Right.
deregulation and all that stuff. That like you start saying the things that corporations and executives want to hear, which is that I'm going to lower taxes and make it easier for you under the belief that you're going to do all these things and hire more people. Come on, like that has not happened. Just so happens that it does not trickle down. But yeah, you kind of knew what would happen. I remember doing that math and saying like, wow, like if he enacts all of these things, the stock market is going to boom. And on top of that, he was raising, I think, like the standard deduction to like $25,000. He was like basically making it easier for people who already had wealth to really exacerbate the wealth that they have.
Yeah.
But then you start to like, again, like start thinking about it and say, well, that's a good thing. But then you start saying, well, yeah, but like a lot of people aren't even invested. A lot of people don't have that much in it. It's like you're not really benefiting those people that much. And then also, like, we're really, really like hoping that corporations aren't going to take that money as bonuses, or executives rather aren't going to take that money as bonuses, that they're going to create more jobs. They're actually not going to do that. They're actually going to do the opposite, which is like fire a lot of people to further exacerbate like the profitability. And so that on top of like all the other things, I think is what really, really just kind of shaped my point of view on it. And, I distinctly remember, I think you were pregnant at the time. And I was on a work trip and I was in Hilton Head, South Carolina. And it was so interesting because it was a beautiful property. And it also happened to be during the time where there just seemed to be like this rash of police killings.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever something was like getting nationwide attention, it just felt like I was in a completely different world. It was like I'm in Hilton Head. There's obviously a bunch of things on the news that is really alarming, that's like impacting the soul of the country. And the leaders of the company were saying absolutely nothing. Like we know that there are times
It's still like that.
where something happens and people say, hey man, I know today's tough, so if everybody can just like be mindful. And I just remembered that it was silent.
Yeah.
And it was happening with the leaders, and it was happening with the government leaders and the president, who just was like not concerned with it at all. And here I am like in Hilton Head, South Carolina, and I'm like legitimately concerned for like my safety, because I'm like one of a few people that look like me, like probably for 15, 20 miles. Like, and it was just like, wow, like they're out here playing volleyball and having a good time. Like we just live in two completely different worlds. And it just felt like money does not solve for that.
No.
You know what I mean? Like in
No.
those moments, kind of bringing it back full circle. Like while I may have 60% more than I may have had, I still don't feel safe.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so to your point around quality of life, it's like, I don't know that this is the world that I really want to live in. There are some people who don't experience these things. And so I can understand why to them all problems are solved, or there isn't a problem at all, because I have 60% more or more than that than I did when this person first took office. It wasn't my first time thinking about it, but what it really forced me to like really think about was in a way to appreciate how complicated this process and this relationship is, and to ask yourself, like, are you okay with that? Like, is this what you want to do? And then I think taking that a step further, because this is in part what we're asking people to do in our book, and a lot of the work that we do is to reconcile that feeling and to give them a proposal to say, hey, if this game feels a little dirty, it's because it is, right? It's a very dirty game that we're playing here, that we are thinking that we're going to play in this mud and not have to experience any kind of moral or ethical dilemma. And sorry, it just doesn't work that way. But if you at least put a time lap on it, right? Or a time limit on it, rather, where it's like, yeah, I'm only going to do this for 10 years, for 15 years. And after that, I'm on cash out, and I'm going to make very different decisions around how I spend my time, how I live my life, how I raise my child, etc. This is what I think a lot of people are being faced with here, like as they're making these two decisions, because it's not to suggest, and I do not want people to believe, that the stock market boomed because of Trump's policies. It was already booming.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And I would imagine that most people were very happy about that. But now you might say,
and it's continued to boom,
and it has continued to boom.
President Biden.
Correct. So that's an empty argument. That is a worthless argument. It's not a high quality argument. And so that's like my big point there. It was like, look, there are ways to make the stock market boom. There are ways for you to support Democratic parties and Democratic candidates without sacrificing your
Returns.
retirement or returns. Like, that's ridiculous.
That's ridiculous.
That's ridiculous.
Because when you take a long-term perspective, it doesn't matter who wins in the sense, and I'm talking about the stock market and the stock market only. It doesn't matter who wins in the sense that there are returns to be had regardless of who's in the White House.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about the dirtiness of it. And when you think about the relationship between our government and the corporations that operate underneath it, it's not a romance. It's a marriage of convenience. And it's complete with this unspoken rule that no matter what chaos is happening in the household, them bills gonna get paid.
Yeah.
And by bills, we mean returns, right? Like if this was a family, the government would be the parents and the stock market would be that slightly rebellious teenager. And you've got these two parents. One is like, bad cop and disciplinarian, and the other one is more lenient and like free spirited. But at the end of the day, the kid's gonna go to college regardless. Or in stock terms, it's going to be a return. Why? Because the government only has one job and it never changes, which is maintaining the conditions under which companies can be profitable so that our economy remains stable. That's the only reason it exists. It's as true under a Democratic president as it is under a Republican president. There are regulations, incentives, even the occasional bailout that companies can rely on. But make no mistake, they're going to keep operating. They're going to keep growing. They're going to keep providing returns in the long run because that's the marriage. Yeah. That's how it works.
Yeah, they're the DJ. The turntables make wild, boy. They won't fall down. That is their job.
You the rapper, I'm the DJ.
That's it. Let's keep this thing together. Okay, so I want to do a little bit of rapid fire here because obviously there's a little bit more to these candidates and their policies than just the stock market and fighting inflation. But I'm sharing this because, again, I do think that there are some people who are reading the highlights, the clips, and they're kind of running with those things. And so here's a little bit of rapid fire. So both the Harris and the Trump campaign have promised to eliminate taxes on tips. I'm willing to bet most people have realized that may just have been a Trump speaking point, but it's not an either or thing, right? So if that's your thing, you happen to be in the hospitality industry, that is something that both parties have actually committed to. Social Security, Trump wants to end taxes on Social Security benefits. Harris has no plans to cut taxes on overtime pay or on Social Security benefits. Both Harris and Trump promised to increase border security. And so if that's a big issue for you, right, like going back to the way these proposing that they fight inflation through tackling illegal immigration, both have basically promised to increase border security. Both the Harris and Trump campaign plan to address the high cost of housing, but their methods obviously differ. So you've got the tax credits and all those things. Trump approach is a little different. He wants to lean solely on tax incentives to help homeowners. So he's not looking to like invest and try to boost supply or any of that stuff. But as you might expect, he's been pretty light on details. You know what I mean? And I mean it. Like, do yourself a favor, maybe go into incognito mode, go to the website. Like, it's not a game. Like, they are legitimately no details.
Ask ChatGPT.
No. Well, maybe chat. I know I did ask the AI bot and it was like, no, we know what
we're not even going to that website.
We're not getting involved.
There's some places we won't crawl.
Yeah. Yeah. So, all that to say, like, those are just like the big issues that I really wanted to address. And I really wanted to make sure that like some of the main speaking points, because they have different speaking points because they're coming at all of these issues from two wildly different areas. But there are also some just very, very clear differences on it. I think it truly, as cliche as it sounds, it is about giving yourself an opportunity to shape the kind of future of this country that you want to live in, whether you have children or not. I'm particularly concerned because I have a child, but that's really what this is about. Like, what kind of country do you want us to be 10 or 20 years from now? Because obviously there are implications based on these kinds of decisions that are made now. And so it's not, unfortunately, about what's going to happen in the stock market over the next 10 years. It's a much bigger picture, but hopefully this podcast, some of the details that we've shared can help answer some lingering questions, or maybe you're planning on doing some research and you trust that we've done our part here and you don't need to. I still encourage you to do some research, but I think this is ultimately about what you want this country to look like. Yeah. And I'm pretty clear on what I want it to look like and what I don't want it to look like.
And I don't think you can get to that answer until you personally decide what kind of citizen you want to be. One of the odd things about being American and living in this consumer-driven culture and economy is that candidates approach voters as if we're all consumers above all else. And that's not true for every voter. I mean, even if you think about the way that they talk about their policies, they pitch tax cuts or inflation relief like it's some kind of big sale, because who doesn't want a discount, right? They talk about job creation as if it's some product launch, and they never mention these jobs, stability, the quality, the future trajectory. They just sell them as if like, oh, look, I created a job. You don't know if it's going to be there in 2 years. You don't know if it's part-time, full-time, whether it pays well, has benefits. They promote these short-term gains, whether it's stimulus checks or gas rebates, as these immediate rewards, betting that we're going to vote for the person who gives us instant gratification. And it's a classic marketing strategy. Like, it's a limited time offer. You got to vote for me or you're not going to get this $1,200 or this $600 tax credit or whatever it is.
And a lot of people are single issue voters, right? And so
well, a lot of people are consumers first.
Yeah.
And if you don't identify as a consumer first, maybe you're a business owner, or you're a person who's living on limited income, or you're disabled, or you identify as an investor, these tactics look like bad fast food, right? Like, it's available, it's hot, it's food, but it's also like a little suspicious. Like, I don't know that I want to eat it. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's the bucket that we fall in. We got off the creamy crack of consumerism. I'm on my Johnny Cochran today. We got off the creamy crack of consumerism a long time ago. Wow. But I know that we're not alone in this. Like, if you talk to a business owner, they're probably thinking, I don't need a coupon. What I need is a better supply chain. Business owners are specifically used to thinking beyond the short term and actually considering long-term implications of the decisions that they make. Yeah. And so they're not just like, they're not impressed, right? If you talk to someone who lives on a tight budget, fixed income, or with a disability, they're not impressed by tax cuts or promises of better buying power because things got cheaper. They want accessible services. They want policies that assume not everybody has disposable income. And then long-term investors are not just looking for big blips in the stock market like we saw in 2021. We're not just looking for 1 or 2 years of gains. We want to be able to predictably see where our accounts and our portfolios are going to be in 5 years and 10 years. We have enough to retire on.
And I don't want my portfolio to be susceptible to some crazy thing that the president might have said that might tank the market in a day or two.
Exactly.
And then it bounces back. Like, I don't want...
Or send us into war.
Unnecessary volatility.
Yes. Yeah. Send us into war with some aggressive foreign country, or a war that we're funding because they got aggressive with somebody else. And that's true for both parties. This is the way that you need to approach civic engagement. You can't just fall for the marketing. They spend billions of dollars on marketing. That's a whole other episode about how expensive it is to just run for president, to run for elected office in the United States at any level. Yeah. It's very expensive because they have to market it to us. So you decide if you want to be a consumer citizen, as the brilliant Dr. Tressie McMillan Cottom calls it, or you want to be someone who has an active role and understands what an individual vote means and does these days. Yeah. That's on you. Our goal is to show you that whatever you decide, whether it's voting for one party or another or not voting at all, is going to impact your wallet because you do belong to a system. Yep. This ain't no island. This is the United States of America, and we're all connected one way or the other. And when things are bad, whether it's in your town or in your state or just in your region, things get violent. It gets hard. And capitalism, where we are, it's a very violent economic system. And the goal is to protect your neck. And the way that we do that is by being engaged in politics, by being engaged in policy and using the power that we have to get the results that we're looking for.
Look, I'm not shy about saying that we are Team Harris over here. I'm not going to get into the details or whether or not she's a perfect candidate, and I'm certainly not going to get into
there are no perfect candidates.
The crazy, conspiracy theories and misinformation that's been spewed. But without question, we just do not subscribe to the vision of the country that Donald Trump is proposing at all. And so I hope you don't either. I'm not even going to lie about it. Like, it is that serious. The stakes are just that high. And I hope to just help to do my part in shaping the kind of future that I think is bright and optimistic and diverse and fruitful for everyone. And so that is my hope. And, time will tell. But let us know in the comments how you feel, what you're thinking about, what we should be thinking about. And hopefully we have good news to share in the next episode.
All right, y'all. Well, thank you for listening to another episode of the Rich and Regular podcast. If you like what you heard, you already know what to do. Head on over to the ratings and review page and put your vote on the 5-star mark. That doesn't really work, but y'all know what it is.
I knew you was going to do that.
If you don't like what we said, don't say
exercise
nothing.
your right to
Exercise
leave
your
a
right.
5-star rating. And review.
Yeah, that's what it is.
That was
Exercise your right. You know, I've been preaching all day. Johnny Cochran is off the books. We will see y'all next week. If you like videos like this and want to see more, make sure you click subscribe and turn on notifications.